This is the virtual launch of the book, The South Africa We Want to Live In, which is published by Ikusasa Media with the support of the Community Chest. My name is Ryland Fisher. I'm the CEO of Ikusasa Media, and I will be your co-facilitator this evening, along with my comrade, Jordan Peters. The book we are virtually launching today is the result of a project that started more than 2 years ago with a dialogue at the District 6 Homecoming Center, where we discussed the role of NGOs in an election year. We quickly realized that our focus was too narrow and that there was a need for a broader discussion about the kind of society we want to live in. This then led to a series of dialogues all over the Western Cape, where we talked about the society we want to live in. When we compiled the report on the dialogues, we realized that we cannot talk about the South Africa we want to live in if we only had contributions from people living in the Western Cape. So we then reached out to people from across the country to add their voices. And the result is this book that now contains the views of hundreds of people, some who attended our dialogues, and some who wrote contributions, especially for this book. It is clear that while there might be nuanced differences in what we see as important, depending on where we live and other factors in our background, there are some issues that most people agree on. One of these is the importance of sorting out the economy. Without proper economic development, we will not be able to create jobs and provide the necessary services to millions of South Africans. Services such as decent education, proper healthcare, decent housing, access to swift justice, and a safe and secure living environment. Racism was brought up many times at our dialogues, as well as the land issue, or rather the lack of political leadership on both issues. One of the unique things we did at our dialogues was that we invited panelists, but not to speak first and not from a podium. We always started our discussion from the floor, and then we allowed the panelists to respond. This was important because we believed that we needed to tap into the expertise of the many people who attended our dialogues, and not just those who were considered as experts. We have found that quite often, true wisdom can be found among those who are often referred to as so-called ordinary people. So today we host the second launch of this book. The first one was held in December, and one of the differences is that the first launch was hybrid, with about 50 people at the District 6 Homecoming Center, while the others were online. This launch is completely online. We hope that we will still be accommodate questions and comments from the floor. Please feel free to share your questions or your views on the various platforms, such as the Zoom chat or under comments on Facebook. We will make an effort to accommodate your comments and questions, in this discussion. But most importantly, please order copies of the book. This is a book launch after all. So you can order it via the Community Chest website, or you can go and buy it at some leading bookstores, such as the Book Lounge and Clark's Books. And we're hoping to introduce a few other bookstores over the next couple of days. This book is a perfect corporate or personal gift for anyone who is passionate about improving the lives of the majority in South Africa. We hope that you will enjoy the read and actively participate in the discussion about the South Africa we want to live in. Now I'd like to introduce my co-facilitator. Jordan Peters is a young activist who is committed to seeing real and sustainable change in our country. She was an activist in the Fees Must Fall movement in, I think, 2015, 2016, but she still plays a role in several activist organizations. We believe that her voice is an important voice to listen to if one is talking about the future of this country. Over to you, Jordan.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ryland, and thank you to everyone for having me. And so since I guess you gave us the background of the book, I'll kind of take us to the theme, so to speak, of tonight, which is human rights. And so I'll just quickly share some of my thoughts. If you do hear a train in the background, I apologize. I'm in Woodstock. So whenever Human Rights Day comes along, I always ask myself why we talk about human rights as if we already have it, as if it's something that we've already attained. It seems that because it's contained in our Bill of Rights, it has supposedly become a tangible thing, something that we can see, something that we can experience and touch. But in reality, for most young people, and perhaps even society at large, a belief in human rights appears to be tantamount to a reliance on faith. So essentially, in the same way that you have to believe that God is there, or whatever your belief system is the same way that you have to believe that your human rights are there. So it's something in the air. It can't be touched, and for most, it can't be used. But we keep believing that we somehow have these human rights, and I think it's no longer a controversial opinion to have that Human Rights Day has become a waste of time.
Jordan, sorry, could I ask you to put on your video, please, first?
No problem. Okay, can you see me? Okay, great. So just quickly continuing from where I left off, but I was saying that at this point in time, I think that it's no longer a controversial opinion to say that Human Rights Day and the like have, just become a waste of time and really just another day for us to get off of work or out of school. But tonight, I'd actually like to go a step further and say that celebrating days such as Human Rights Day is an insult to the oppressed and working class masses across the world. And I will give you my reasoning shortly. I don't think it's necessary to recount the history of human rights. I think most of us are familiar. But what I have always found interesting is the way in which human rights form part of international treaties and declarations that spell out the minimum standards necessary for people to live with dignity. And many countries like South Africa, for example, incorporate human rights in their own laws and policies. And yet, by some twisted miracle, human rights are still something held not by the majority of people in this world, but by the privileged, who are able to secure the enjoyment of these rights and dignities through the use of often ill-begotten capital. I would then like to go a step further and say that this human rights focus or obsession that governments seem to hold is nothing but a pretense, a charade, and a deflection of reality. I think in South Africa, we have a great example where our Bill of Rights clearly does not reflect in South African society. And it therefore becomes clear that governments perform this idealism of human rights, when in reality, they are the main ones who contravene the human rights of their citizens. So what is the purpose then of human rights? Why do we have it? And why do governments always kind of portray themselves as the defenders of human rights and the givers of human rights? So again, I would like to be bold and to say that in the same way capitalism has made use of diversity, equality, and inclusivity units to feign progress, governments too use this notion of human rights that they've supposedly embedded in their constitutions or in their laws to feign concern for their citizens while continuing to oppress them unabated. Human rights, I like to use this example with my friends, but human rights feels like the college essay capitalism had to write to show how much it cares. It feels like a side project, which is still on the introductory chapter and that has never really reached any point of fruition. And the state talks the human rights talk across the world, but it is clearly not concerned with its implementation or even adhering to these human rights, which it has itself embedded in its laws. So intentional or not, these conversations around human rights help, I believe, to maintain the function of our current crumbling systems. When we talk about human rights as if we have it, that is in itself a betrayal of the experiences of working class people across this world who clearly do not have these human rights, and they hold no value to the people on the ground. Yesterday, I was at a service delivery protest held in Sea Point. It was organized by the Social Justice Coalition in tandem with 23 informal settlements from the Cape Flats. And the demands were very, very simple. These communities were asking for running water and toilets, sanitation. That's all they were asking for. One delegate from one of these communities said that there were 67,000 people in their community and they all made use of 5 camps right here in Cape Town. So where is his human rights? When is he going to get it? And then kind of just looking at the world right now, there are multiple genocides happening. Police brutality has been on the rise across the globe, and we even now have a phenomenon where governments can just switch off the internet when there are moments of civil unrest. So where are these human rights that we keep talking about? And why do we keep talking about them? And will the perpetrators of the violence against us, the state or the government, will they actually care if they're called out for contravening human rights? And I think when looking at South Africa, we have to ask ourselves a serious question: is like, despite this, amazing constitution and the Bill of Rights and dignity and equality, does the South African government even care about human rights? Has it ever cared, or was that all just a facade, a pretense? But yeah, so I guess, how do we bring human rights from the philosophical, academic, and theoretical plane into the real world? And if we can't do that, if we can't actually have human rights, why do we keep pretending that we can? Is that not in itself just a distraction to prevent us from fighting, the good fight? But yeah, so those are my thoughts on human rights. And now I'll just quickly move into the introduction of our first panelist, Albie Sachs, Justice Albie Sachs. So a quick bio: Judge Albie Sachs is an activist, lawyer, writer, and former Justice of the Constitutional Court. And I will try to keep my introduction short. I am a bit of a fan. So I was quite chuffed to be introducing Albie. Like I said, I was quite a fan of his during my studies at UCT in the law faculty, and I spent many a day summarizing his judgments. There is a bit of a running joke, though, that Albie Sachs was the bleeding heart justice. So, if you couldn't remember in the exam, if you couldn't remember what the crux of the judgment was, but if Albie Sachs was the author, you knew it had something to do with human rights, equality, dignity, and the like. So, and we're also a brilliant writer. That was also kind of the overall theme. So I wanted to kind of pose a question about that, or kind of use that as the basis of my question. So what I always found curious, and maybe I just went to the wrong university, but I was possibly one of the few people that was so enamored by your judgments and your human rights focus. UCT law faculty is a den of capitalism, and it seems sometimes, like their main focus is to create foot soldiers for capitalism. And like I said, maybe that's, like my fault for not going to a human rights focused institution. But I was always so surprised from the onset of my degree and throughout, that I was the only person that I knew in my year who actually wanted to do human rights after I graduated and specialized in that field. Everyone was very corporate centric and kind of wanted to, work for one of the big 5 law firms. So I guess my first question to you, Albie, is if this is the current tone of the legal fraternity in South Africa, if our legal system is already a white male dominant structure, how do we then bring the Bill of Rights to fruition when the tool, the legal system, is still extremely conservative, and legal scholars that are being outputted by our institutions are themselves just a recurrence of this theme? How do we then, attain these human rights when the tool and the system doesn't really allow that? Yeah, that is my That is my question. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give it over to you now.
I want to be seen. I'm wearing my best Madiba shirt. Please let me in. Open the door, Richard.
Richard.
Albie, you are in. You have to just put your camera on.
I'm clicking it and it's saying that you haven't let me in.
We can see you.
Now I should come. Okay, Jordan. It's amazing listening to you. You wiped out the whole of the first part of my life. You wiped out the whole of the second part of my life. And then you tell me you love me philosophically. And I think in a sense, you hate human rights so much because you love it so much. You want it so much. And you feel almost a sense of despair because we have a beautiful constitution with great ideals. And we're holding up this marvelous, almost mirage. And you see poverty, you see hunger, you see people being abused, and it crushes you and it hurts you. And in a sense, UCT is turning out people for corporate law. They clearly failed. In your case, something went wrong. And I love your defiance and I love your energy. I'm going to reminisce a little bit. That's the danger of this intergenerational thing. I was an activist in the early 1950s. You were an activist a couple of years ago. And I'm going to tell some stories. And we used to speak about so-called human rights on the left, so-called human rights. And we did so because we couldn't bear Henry Kissinger, American Foreign Minister, State Department, would speak about human rights, and train assassins to kill the democratically elected socialist president of Chile. So we said so-called human rights. So it was like one word, so-called human rights. And then in exile in London, I met people from Latin America, and they spoke about derechos humanos with the same passion that we spoke about national liberation. We said, we're not fighting for human rights, we're fighting for national liberation, to change the oppressive system. Then when we get that, then we can have human rights. You can't have human rights within the system of apartheid. But they spoke about human rights with that passion, and I said, no, it's not so called. We can't hand over human rights to the bourgeoisie. That's what you're doing. You're giving it to them on a silver platter. You're saying you're the apostles of human rights. We negate human rights. We're not interested in human rights because it's simply a mirage. So my life then became dedicated to saying, let's make human rights real. It doesn't stop at the factory gate. It doesn't stop at the entrance to the farm. It doesn't stop at the front door of the house. Human rights have got to be there for everybody. And part of the vision we created when we drafted the Constitution was a constitution for the people. And the Constitution wasn't drafted at Kempton Park. It was drafted at the Constitutional Assembly, democratically elected people. More than half of them had been in jail, in exile, in the underground. There's a very large women's bloc. There's a very large bloc of workers from the union movement. In that sense, it's a fighting instrument. And it's a very beautiful instrument. So I can fully appreciate the sadness and the anger you feel at the discrepancy between what the Constitution is proclaiming as the rights of everybody, dignity, equality, freedom, and the real lives lived. But you absolutely don't have any idea of how much we had to break down that you could stand up and speak in the way that you do now, denounce in the way that you do now, that you can have the options that you can have now. You would have been banned, arrested, thrown into jail. I was tortured by sleep deprivation. I was blown up by a bomb. It's a whole different world. And so we decided we are fighting not for human rights, we are fighting for self-determination of the majority of our people, Black oppressed people. Self-determination in our conditions in South Africa doesn't take the form of secession, an independent state. It takes the form of breaking down the internal colonialism, the internal barriers with the whites as a supreme class, like a ruling class. So it takes the form of democracy, and through democracy and the votes and the rights that we've got, political rights that we've won, then we can now get human rights. And we had to fight for social and economic rights as well as fundamental human rights. Now it's up to us to give meaning to those rights, not to abandon the right to the idea of rights, but to give meaning to those rights. I'll just conclude with the following. Why am I so optimistic about South Africa today? And it's, in a sense, very biographical and personal. I was in Mozambique after independence. It was fantastic. It was full of vivas and songs and people's power. And we were marching in the streets, the workers and the peasants, and revolutionary intellectuals, for the masses, for the people. Everything was for the people, for the masses. And I enjoyed that. I had two arms then, and I would raise my right arm with vivas and sing the songs, because everything seemed to be, that was the way the world should go, towards socialism and for the masses. There was no scope for opposition. Opposition didn't vanish. It went underground. We got picked up in the Cold War. We had bitter civil war. I lost an arm. There are thousands and thousands of Mozambicans without legs because they were hit by landmines. There was something like 2 million refugees left the country, or 2 million refugees, internal refugees. They were child soldiers. So Mozambique persuaded me, you have to have pluralism, you have to have space for opposition. And we've got to be better than the opposition when there is that space, not through our power, people's power, but through the strength of rationality and honest integrity of our arguments. Secondly, when it came to the rights of the poor, we didn't bother about bourgeois legality, we said at the time. But we found the well-off, the well-connected people always knew somebody who could speak to the police in charge. The poor needed the law. That was another discovery for me. The rich don't need the law. They've got the power, they've got the wealth. They can escape, they can travel, they can hire the lawyers. The poor need the law. So that became the theme of my life. And I'd like that for you to be the theme of your life. The poor need the law, can use the law, don't abandon the law, and that human rights have to become fully human rights for everybody. And we have to use the Bill of Rights as an emancipatory weapon, instrument, if you like, not allowed to be narrowed down to the right to property, the right to control, the right to spew hatred and demean and denounce others that has been in the way of the narrow vision of human rights in the past. In any event, welcome to the world of contestation, the challenges. My heart will continue to bleed forever. I love being called a bleeding heart. If my heart goes, I hope my brain goes before my heart goes, let me put it that way. And it's lovely to feel your passion and your enthusiasm and commitment. Keep that spirit. Don't lose your idealism. Don't give it into cynicism, and don't hand over fundamental rights and human rights to the bourgeoisie, to the rich, to the wealthy, to the powerful, to the well-connected. Claim human rights, use human rights, embrace the human rights, and find that social solidarity with others in that same advance.
So I think now we'll be having a quick answer and question and answer session, because we know that you do have to leave a bit earlier. So I already have my question ready to go, yes. But let me open it up to the floor. Does anybody have any questions for Albie?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'll ask a question. Albie, I mean, the passion that Jordan displays, it's important. And I think what happened with some of us, you know, we kind of stepped aside after 1994. A lot of us kind of thought, okay, you know, I mean, 1994 kind of signaled Uhuru. We had this warped idea of freedom. And we've kind of seen since 1994 that things have not been as clear-cut. as you know, as we thought it would be. And so, in fact, I think what has happened more recently is that quite a few people whose activism had expired had kind of found a way of renewing the lease of their activism, and have, in a way, almost be forced to, to come out and fight against people who were threatening our democracy. And so I wanted us to maybe talk about it, because one of the things that Jordan and I talk about often is she accuses us of neglecting the democracy project, leaving it unfinished, and then people like her have to come and try to finish it. And so maybe I'd like to hear your views on that.
Okay, well, first of all, she's got the energy. She's asking hard questions. She's got the passion. It's something inside you, the feeling that you have. I hope she doesn't burn out kind of too quickly. You need patience, and you need to not lose your outrage and intention and thoughtfulness and sharp vision, but also to choose your battles, choose the allies you work with, don't make unnecessary enemies, have a focus, and also you've got to enjoy life. So many people I know in the movement become sour early on with long faces. They chew themselves up, they eat themselves up. You must laugh, and you must sing, and you must dance, and you must love food and movies and books and people. You know, all of those things are very, very important in a struggle. I must say, in our struggle, we had terrible times in all sorts of circumstances. We never lost our humor. Ryland, you'll remember it, even in the dark days. In my case, I wasn't disappointed by the changes, because I'd lived through the Mozambican experience, where the convulsions were so bad, and afterwards they collapsed, and it's not a people's power country anymore. And the corruption is miles worse in Mozambique, and it's not denounced and exposed like it is in this country. And the loss of life was huge. So I'm less demoralized or less disappointed by the slowness of change here. And I'm pleased by the advances we've made. It's not a small thing that 16, 18 million people receive social grants. I think we're the only country in Africa with anything like that. It's not a small thing that something like 12, 14 million people have moved from shacks into not wonderful homes, but homes with water, electricity, sewage. It's not nothing that UCT now. I was there when my wife Vanessa got a master's degree 18 months ago. It's fantastic. It's a transformed university, whatever Jordan might say. The feel of it, and the parents there down from Limpopo and elsewhere, the chancellor, it's changed. The doors of learning are being opened, and the people coming there are making new demands in our society. And so I feel in that sense buoyed by what I see. Maybe I was protected. You know, we speak now about living in a bubble. Sports people live in a bubble. I lived in a bubble, which is called the Constitutional Court. I wasn't in Parliament. I wasn't in business. I didn't have to make compromises. I could live a very pure life intellectually and in terms of thought, maintaining the values that we've been fighting for. And I'm proud of what I fought for the truth. And I'm proud of our democracy. It's under enormous stress at the moment. I think it's strong enough to hold. It's strong because our institutions, core institutions, are strong. And it's strong because the people want them. People don't want crooks. They don't want deviousness. They don't want lies. They don't want fake claims to revolutionary transformation and change by people who are simply lining their own pockets. They want authenticity. So, Jordan, I think, in a sense, you're going to have the enemies, the energies, the sharpness, the vitality, hopefully the sense of fun. I think there's a lot of humor inside you to now pose your own questions and find your own friends and be as the way, you know, when I spoke, I don't think you were at UCT yet when I spoke to the law school. Maybe it's about 6 years ago. Maybe you were there, I don't know. And I saw about 250 students, and I said, when I look at you, it sounds like the height of narcissism. But I see 250 young Albie Saxes there, looking and thinking, and who's this guy, and what's going on? It was very exciting for me. So I don't think the corporatization has taken over. I think there are lots of people who are torn between different tension possibilities. I think we live in a very capitalist environment. People want to make good, and we fought for the right of people to make their own choices. But fortunately, there are lots and lots and lots of people like yourself, demanding change, demanding human solidarity, for whom this theme of Ubuntu is very, very real. And it's what I connect up with is your spirit and your energy. That's something you can't fake and you can't manufacture. That comes from inside you. And with the weapons and tools that you've learned at UCT, even if you use it to combat UCT, keep going, keep on the fight.
Thank you, Albie. I think maybe at this point we will allow Albie to leave if he has to. We would love you to stay on.
Sorry, just say I'm on SAFM. I'm being interviewed, and then I'm doing an interview after that. So it's quite a busy, for some reason, this period of virtual activity has tripled my output. So I pack in 3 or 4 sessions a day when once it would be only one of them. And I thank you, Ryland. Good luck with the book. I don't know how many more book launches you're going to have. Maybe you can have the record for the book that's had the most book launches in human history.
No. I've known of a couple of books have had like 10 book launches. This is only our second one. But thank you so much. Thank you for participating, and good luck with the SAFM interview. Thank you. I'd like to now move on to our next panelist. Lorenzo Davids, the outgoing CEO of the Community Chest. He has spent more than 30 years in the development NGO, NPO, and social justice arena. He has served on several boards, on development agencies in the UK, US, in Australia, and he's done a whole lot of other things. So Lorenzo, what I would like to, the question that I'm trying to grapple with is, how well are we doing in South Africa in terms of human rights, and what more should you be doing?
That's an interesting question, thank you. It is a very complex democracy. It was never going to be non-complex. As Albie says, the undoing, the destructuralizing, the deconstruction of privilege and class and race as we inherited it, it was going to be a piece of work that would require a significant force of courage from the oppressed as they constructed their own liberation. And within that space, to deconstruct oppression and to construct your liberation on a human rights model or within a human rights context is always perilous, because you want to react, you want to almost do so by force, and often without respect for rights. And yet within the context of our own consciousness, the context of our own awareness and our own commitment to human rights, we try and deconstruct within the framework of human rights. And that's a particularly hard piece of work to do. That is very difficult, because if you deconstruct in a human rights culture, you have to be careful how you deconstruct. And so that's what becomes so important. And I think what Steve Biko said, that Dr. Steve Biko said in I Write What I Like, one of my favorite quotes, he says, in due course, we will bestow on South Africa its greatest gift. And then it says, a more human face. In due course, we will be able to bestow on South Africa its greatest gift, a more human face. And that's the preciousness of this human rights journey we are on, is that in the cruelties of moving towards that state of a functioning human rights state, and I use the word cruelty on purpose because it's painful for us, it's painful for me and for people like Jordan and for others to bear the scars of what we've had to live through. It's painful for Albie to be as gracious and generous as he is with parts of his body blown off. And so in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of liberation, in pursuit of a human rights culture, there is this notion that we have to be kind. And that's almost a cruelty towards the oppressed, because the rights that we want is not just the rights for ourselves, it's also the rights for those who were the oppressors, for those who did the oppressing. And in that's the human face that Dr. Biko spoke about. That's the human face that Dr. Biko informed us that we must bestow on this country. And I think that's the hard part of building this kind of democracy that we are with. It's not despite the fact that the elections was won by the liberation movements, the government is run by the liberation movements, it still is a complex task to do so with a mindset or an architecture that's premised on human rights for all, and those rights extend to the oppressors as well. That's the hard part, and nobody must underestimate the hard work that is going on in this reconstruction process or in this deconstruction process at this stage still. Now, I understand there's a frustration about how fast the government or how slow the government is moving. There's an angst about whether this is becoming undone, whether the democratic project is being undone and is falling apart, whether the factionalism within the liberation movements are beginning to face each other instead of facing the oppressor and facing those that seek the destruction and the undermining of our democracy. But we have to understand how complex that is. I cannot emphasize enough the hard parts of dealing with the fine bits of oppression in this country that people still face. Just take housing, for example. Which city in this country, when the Constitution promises a house for everybody, a place, an abode, a safe abode, which city, which municipality in this country has drafted a strategic plan that has a house in its planning for every citizen? Take the 6 million, 5.5 million people in Cape Town. Does Cape Town, as one of the second largest metro in this country, have a strategic plan that says within 5 years we can deliver a house for everybody? They will have funding. They will get funding for new water plants because that's in the interest of industry. They will get funding for private procurement of electricity because that's in the interest of industry and commerce. But they will not get private funding for housing. They will not say, hold on, we need to take out funding and secure a loan internationally to build 6 million houses. But they will do so for water, they will do so for electricity, which I agree with. It is necessary. But will they do so for housing? No. They will allow housing to become a miserable existence for millions of people without there being a concomitant strategic plan as there is for power and as there is for water, but there won't be for housing. And so the housing crisis remains. That's what I'm talking about, deconstructing this culture of oppression, because these little bits of things, these small things slip through the cracks. So we won't comment on, oh, well, the national minister only made so much available for housing. Well, if we can secure foreign funding for water and for rail infrastructure and for electricity, why can't we get it for housing? Housing is a incredibly important feature of one's safety and security. And we are providing minimal housing for our people. So deconstructing that. Pit latrines in this country is another thing. 1,400 schools alone in the Eastern Cape have pit latrines still. How is that possible? How can ministers renew their cars every 2 to 3 years, but they cannot find money to eradicate pit latrines? One flush toilet costs 15,000 Rand. To renew the car of a minister costs 800,000 Rand. ministers, deputy ministers, and DGs, if they were to give up the renewal of their cars for just 2 years, we could meet most of the eliminate most of the pit latrines in the Eastern Cape schools. So that's what we should be looking at in these minute details of constructing human rights. I think we are dilly-dallying in the philosophy, we are dilly-dallying in the blue sky thinking around it, but in the hardcore practice, designing housing, designing flush toilets, designing proper schools, those are the human rights issues that we must be advancing in the course of our liberation, in the course of how this country manages the rights of people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What we will do is, after we've had inputs from the different panelists, I think we've got 3 more panelists, then we'll have a bit of a Q&A. So people are welcome to send us questions. Those who are on Zoom can use the chat function on Zoom, and those who are on Facebook can also use the comments, and we will make sure that we will put your questions to the different panelists. Over to you, Jordan.
Thanks, Ryland. I'm kind of sad that I'll be sacked so soon. I had a lot to respond to what he said. But anyway, getting into our next speaker, Rebecca Zimkwana. So just a quick bio. She is a music lecturer at Stellenbosch University, where she has taught ethnomusicology and world music. She is a traditional musician and has been a cultural activist for many years. And she has also served as a board member of both the One City Many Cultures Project and the Cape Cultural Collective. So just to give context, and I see you aren't doing that, Ryland, but with Ncebe Kazi, I've actually been in dialogues with her before, and ideologically I would say that I have had some differences of opinions, specifically on her thoughts around young people. However, what always kind of hit me when listening to her was her honesty, very clear transparency, and a very clear will or an interest in improving this country. And while that might seem like a given, I think that many people in various notable positions within this social justice realm from my perspective, don't really appear to have a sincere desire to actually change the fabric of society, but instead enjoy never-ending dialogues, after which they go back to their suburban lifestyles paid for by inflated salaries in the NGO sector. So I think when at these dialogues, I always kind of just get, annoyed with what appears to kind of be just a vanity project. But Ncebe Kazi always kind of speaks to a very open and transparent way of talking about the issues, which I really enjoy. So the question I wanted to put to you was about one of your comments you made in one of the dialogues about young people in particular. You said that young people are not guided enough to sacrifice for the collective. And this is actually, I think, maybe the statement I fully agree with. And I'm currently actually also struggling with, within my own activism, within Fees Must Fall. So we were kind of shown during Fees Must Fall that young people, when they are, directly involved, are willing to take to the streets, right? They're willing to shut down institutions, willing to fight the police. But this, unfortunately, does not extend to the issues we face in our communities. And it has been quite a difficult task trying to get our comrades to kind of go beyond the institutions that we find ourselves in. And this has occurred again, quite recently. I'm sure everyone has seen what's been happening within the university spaces. And then on top of that, we kind of have never-ending petty party squabbles that have been crippling the movement since 2016. And these are students, might I add, who are already politically conscious, right? So who've already read Sipiko, read Fanon, read W.E. Du Bois. These are students who are already kind of immersed within political thinking and organizing. And they also just kind of like 10% of the overall youth population. So we also like point that out. But then in a country with a very big focus on education. You know, the famous Nelson Mandela quote that education is the tool, and with a very big focus on getting degrees, which these days don't even really mean employment or decent employment. Can you blame the youth? Can you blame young activists? Many of them are first generation students, myself included, who are expected to get their first jobs after graduating and then immediately start helping to provide for their families. So how do we balance this expectation of, you know, the generational mandates that we are supposed to take or hoist upon ourselves versus the stomach politics of this nation, which young people are not immune from? So just again, kind of going back to your quotes, that young people are not guided enough to sacrifice for the collective. What type of guidance do you think we need, or what is the way forward in kind of trying to deal with our own personal interests, individual interests that aren't just, you know, individualism, you know, textbook, but actually have to do with our families, our siblings, our younger siblings, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, but then also looking at the issues in a broader context. How do we navigate that? But yeah, that is my question to you. Thank you for joining us.
Molweni. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for your question. Thank you to Mr. Ryland Fisher for the invitation. I would like to start off, and I will get to the answer, but I'd like to start off by reading from the book, The South Africa We Want to Live In. And I want to really today focus on the Black woman erasure. And I'm going to read Mike Fraser's contribution, which was one of the contributions that stuck out to me and still is with me. Mike Fraser: the South Africa I want to live in is one where every citizen is respected for just being human. So if we are serious about saving our beloved country, we South Africans need to restore our common humanity. The first thing is to restore our identity at a personal level, so that we can restore our identity as a South African nation. To achieve this, we need to think back to where we lost our identity and why we adopted our current fake identities we proudly cling to. We all know the apartheid laws were legalized and institutionalized to start the divisions that exist within our country today. Just to name a few: Race Classification Act, Group Areas Act, Separate Amenities Act, Job Reservation Act, Immorality Act, and so on. These laws were legal, forcefully and violently enforced upon the majority of South Africans, and so the human race was butchered up into apartheid identities. We were forcibly and violently created in the image of apartheid, and we accepted that, and I grew up in a perfectly normal South African family. My grandfather was a Scotsman. That's where the Fraser surname comes from. And his wife was a Xhosa woman. What a powerful combination. We grew up in migrant location in East London, with just about every ethnic group in South Africa. And then in the early 1960s, we were hit by the Group Areas Act and we were forcibly removed. We, the children, and our grandparents were classified as the other colored, not even colored. We were moved to a colored area. My grandmother was classified as native, and she was moved to a newly established native location called Mdantsane, about 30 kilometers outside East London. When we went to visit her, we had to apply for a permit. She would welcome us, but whenever we left, she would say, "Thanks for visiting the Cafe Girl." These political identities are so ingrained within our apartheid DNA that they are robbing us of becoming a great nation we can become. So that was Mike Frazier's contribution at the Paul Boys. And when we drove there, we passed by the power station that had been bombed during the state of emergency. So there we come back to the question of the collective. Who is this grandmother who couldn't be a powerful combination with the Scotsman? South Africa was a great country before the apartheid laws. I wish South Africans would believe that. We are doing all the self-sabotaging to ourselves. We still are those people who think we need a permit to function, to cooperate, and to be part of society. So I live in a world where I am the imposter. On an everyday basis, it doesn't matter whether I, as a Black woman, am going to buy my groceries, I'm going to buy my medication, I'm going to buy anything. Even the security can treat me badly. So what has we as South Africans done to heal our trauma? Yes, we will deconstruct oppression. We will say where it is. Let's get into the psychological impact, where now as South Africans, we are doing the bad to each other. It is a very difficult country to navigate as a Black woman. It doesn't matter how authentic I want to be, how authentic I want to feel. It is not enough. So I walk around with that imposter syndrome and I try to enjoy my freedom. It's all an irony. It is all an irony. So where then do we take our young people who we are going to leave? We're going to leave you behind, Jordan. We're leaving you behind. Anytime now. And we have fulfilled all we can in that journey. But we are struggling so hard with the South African identity. I mean, the things people say about Tutatu Mandela, the things people say about people who were tortured, like the judge. It's fine to have that amnesia, but you didn't go through that. And when you speak to people who were tortured, they don't forget that pain. But everyone else must forget a pain of apartheid that was instituted, that was accompanied by colonialism, and is corrupted by capitalism. We're hatching eggs here that are eating us back. So we need to build our confidence. And we're not going to build our confidence if we are saying that I am not enough. And the land will definitely not come back. Nothing will happen. Nothing will shift because the political will is just not there. It's not there on a personal human rights level. It's not there on the collective. We keep betraying each other about this promised land. War has to end. Today in Mozambique, it's the same war, exactly the same war. So when is humankind going to learn? Does humankind want to learn, or humankind wants to be a passenger? It wants to be a sheep. So what's all that education for? What's all that advancement for? If there's going to be no accountability. We have radio ads that tell us, please pay your amenities. We come from a past where that was a way to boycott. And no one wants to fix those complexities that Mr. Davids talks about. No one wants to make the sacrifice because apparently it was other people's blood. But whose memory is it? Because some people died, but some people were there when people were dying. And we're going to see it now. The anger is building up. And yes, we're going to have another lockdown. Will people still be focused on attaining a South Africa beyond the pandemic? I don't think so. So people can talk about the Constitution, but do they read it? Do they really read it? Do they really see how really the poor need the law? Do they see that? They don't want to see that because it's better when you don't see. It's better when you're in denial. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure, very profound words, Abakazi. Like we said, after all our panelists have been given an opportunity to make some introductory comments, we will then have a bit of a Q&A, and we've got some questions already that have come in. Let me introduce our next panelist. Dr. Rapiti is, and I don't know what the EV stands for. Dr. Rapiti, you will have to tell us what it stands for. But Dr. Rapiti is a medical doctor with a practice in East Streets, Mitchell's Plain, and he's been there for the past, I think, 38 years. He's a regular social commentator in newspapers and on other platforms. And he's the kind of person that I know will tell us, you know, what is really happening on the ground. And I'd like to maybe start, Dr. Rapiti, with the same kind of question that I asked Lorenzo. You know, in your opinion, how well are we doing in South Africa in terms of human rights, and what more should we be doing? Over to you.
Hi, good evening, Ryland, and to the other panelists. Am I on? Hello?
You're live.
Hello?
You can switch your camera on, Doctor.
I'm going to try. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Are you okay? Yeah. Let me get this out of the way. Yeah. Good evening, Ryland. Thank you for publishing most of my articles. Not all of your previous editors were very fond of me back in the bad old days of 1980 when you spoke about truth and honesty. I became the most hated guy in Cape Town back in the 70s and 80s, well, in the 80s. And it didn't matter to me if I felt I was being honest in my comments. If I upset you, I'm really sorry about it. It never bothered me, and I went on, and I still do. So I haven't changed, and I'm saddened to say that I thought I will put my pen away from those kinds of thoughts about fighting for justice 25 years after democracy, but I find I still am writing, but in a slightly different way. Yeah, I've listened to a lot of the panelists, and there's a lot to be said, and I picked up, made a few notes. So if my thoughts go helter-skelter, forgive me. I'm not a legal eagle. I cannot talk of human rights like your other two guests, like Jordan and Professor Sachs. I'm more a philosophical guy. I can date my background to fighting injustice from the age of 7. I could never understand why we had to walk in different places, why people were treated differently. So I didn't need to go to university. I had a good sense of values, and from then on, it's sprung. And it's nothing to do with activism. I think an injustice is an injustice, no matter where it is. I really do not think, and this is a very broad statement, there's any country in the world really that has proper human rights, even in fancy old America. I mean, I've been watching something, all that has happened in the world today. If you look back in the 18th century, it was the feudalism that owned all the land. Who's owning all the land today, 200 years later? It's been replaced by the Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezoses. I mean, 10% of the people own 90% of the world's wealth. What is it on earth are they going to do? These people need an education in philosophy. So we're not going to have human rights as long as there's an unfair distribution of wealth. In fact, there's no wealth being distributed by to the 90%. And I like the folk singers, Johnny Rodriguez, that said, if you, those of you know the song, the movie, the LP, Cold Fact, and he said this in the 70s. It's the rich, it's the poor who create the rich folk. That was in 1975. He never sold more than 6 LPs in America, but he sold 250,000. Amazingly, it's the very people who supported apartheid liked him. I wonder if they really understood his lyrics. I just want to say, I'm not very confident, and I'll tell you why. I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. Before we fought apartheid, or during apartheid divided us. The struggle, Ryland, united us. Now we got our democracy. The politicians are once again dividing us because we have Johnny-come-lately politicians who cannot, their IQ is so low. They have only one concern, and that is to make their pockets full. And their pockets are so full, it's just not enough. And the only way these politicians can thrive, and this doesn't occur only in this country. I'm not dissing the politicians in this country, because I just saw a clip of Prime Minister, President Netanyahu of Israel being accused of some corruption in his country. So many presidents get accused of corruption. And you ask yourself, here are people who earn so much. Why do they indulge? Is it the power of the big corporate businesses? And I think, yes, they do play a big hand in this whole thing. I mean, in South Africa, 90% of the wealth, again, is owned by about 4 big corporate companies. A small man has no chance to survive. And that is why we want to know why we've got so much of crime, so much of drugs. Well, there's an unequal distribution. And until we get that right, we're never going to have any kind of human rights. I'm really worried about the fancy legal definitions of human rights. To me, it's one simple word. Is there human dignity? No, there's no human dignity when people have qualifications, have to stand on street corners, beg for food. These are not people who are lazy. These are people who just cannot get jobs. The systems have failed us. Capitalism as a whole has failed the whole of society. I mean, if you look at America, I think it's close on to 30% who lost their homes, lost their jobs, are battling for food. I mean, that's a rich country. So I just don't agree with capitalism, and I mean, we must get away from this notion that, if you're not a capitalist, you must be a communist. It's rubbish. I'm a humanist. I need to ask every one of these Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Zuckerbergs, there's so many little ones of them in this country. How do you sleep at night when your brother goes hungry? Somebody, I think it was Lorenzo, talked about housing. Well, I just heard in the Northwest province, 200 million rands designated for housing was returned because they didn't have some strategy. Now, what rubbish is that? You're given money to build houses, people are battling for them, and you have no strategy. Now, in any normal society, people responsible for that would be kicked out of their profession. And this is where I'm going to be quite strong about it. Our government has failed us. I'm not saying apartheid was great. I do not think we can go back and say what apartheid did, and therefore we're going to justify and say it's not so bad. We gave, like LB sex, or we gave 6 million houses, we're not doing so badly. Man, if you gave 6 million houses when you could have given 12 million houses, and you could have done away with pit latrines, you have failed, and you have failed dismally. We must stop pussyfooting and stop currying favor and making it sound it's great. You have a guy like President Zuma defies the law. If he defies the law, what human rights have we got? If you have got human rights in paper that cannot translate into reality, you have got no human rights. Which takes me to another point, and I think it was Desiree who mentioned the education system. I think our education system in this country, and probably many other countries in the world, sucks, because the education systems are set
It seems that we've lost Dr. Rapiti. Okay, we'll continue with the program. It seems that we've lost him. So hopefully he will be able to, to come back. Let me move on to the next panelist, and then after that we will open the floor and ask some questions ourselves. So our next panelist is Zanaria Bowdens. She's a senior staff member of the Community Chest. She has decades of experience in political activism and of working in civil society. She's also been a cultural activist, a poet, and the chairperson of the Cape Cultural Collective. Over to you, Zanaria.
Thank you, Ryland. I've listened to all the speakers and the very many different viewpoints about the South Africa we want to live in. And many are speaking about what's wrong with our country. And as you know, there is much that is wrong. But what is the country that we actually want to live in? And I think Jordan has, when she sort of started her sort of speaking about the fact that, that we, the questions of young people, the issues at UCT that she experienced, the kind of education that she felt, it was geared towards propping up the system, etc. I was thinking about the passion that we had as young people, as young activists at our institutions. Many of us were at universities too. And I was particularly interested in a comment about not the young people who are activists in the fees must fall sort of situation, the difficulty with getting them to focus on issues outside that particular framework of the university, the fees must fall, etc. And I think I was pondering that as others were speaking. And I think there was one fundamental difference, that we had this huge system which we were up against, the apartheid system. And we as young activists, our activism within those institutions was also about standing or facing down the apartheid system. The two things were not delinked from each other. So we had this bigger cause about the South Africa we wanted to live in at the time. And I think another speaker said in 1994, I think it was you, Ryland, who said in 1994, many of us who had been involved in those struggles kind of demobilized, because so many of the activists that had been involved in those struggles went into government, and we probably thought that they would then, continue the struggle in parliament and in the structures, the new systems, etc. But when you think about it, we have had 369 years, if you take it from now, 369 years ago, Jan van Riebeeck and others came, and colonialism has been over 300 years. We had apartheid 73 years ago. The National Party government came into power, and there was 46 years of apartheid, 46 years of entrenching a brutal, violent system, which told people that they were not anything, they were nothing, they were second-class citizens, not even citizens. And essentially, we've had 27 years of this democracy, which incidentally is the number of years that Nelson Mandela was incarcerated, 27 years. We've had 27 years of democracy. So when one thinks of 27 years of democracy, and we think of what has preceded it, I think it was always going to be a complex, as has been mentioned, and a long struggle to overcome. And what I think has was we had a negotiated settlement, number one. So the many compromises were already made at that point. It wasn't a revolutionary overthrow. But as has been pointed out by Albie, there was a revolutionary overthrow in a country like Mozambique, and look at Mozambique today. So there's no guarantee that if you have a revolutionary overthrow, your outcome is necessarily going to be pro-poor, pro the people, pro all of that. Your systems of governance, however, have to see to the needs of the majority of the people. And I think what we have seen in our country is a sad, disappointing, lack of governance in our country, which was also, is the subject of, some of that is now the subject of the Zondo Commission into State Capture. That is not what we wanted to see in South Africa. We didn't want to have, less than 25 years into our democracy, a commission on state capture, where those who were in power and who we put into power, and I think politicians need to remember that, they get voted into power to serve the people, not to serve themselves, their networks, to put money in their pockets, etc. They have been put there to serve the people. And I'm going to speak about what I have seen happening in the last week as our constitution has come under attack by our former president. There are questions here, what can we do? Now, in last week, former veteran activists and generally people concerned with what they see to be an attack on our institutions, especially our prime governance document, the Constitution, have come out and said we have to defend our democracy. So, and that has not taken a party political stance, which I think is very important at this point. I think anyone concerned right now, if you are an active citizen concerned with our democracy, then it is campaigns such as Defend Our Democracy that need to be supported, but not only for a week or two. We actually need to, wherever we find ourselves in our cultural organizations, in our various formations, etc., to be very seriously looking at, because even though we have a democracy which is less than ideal, the fact of the matter is it can always become worse. I think we are critical of the United States and its policies and its economic system. And Dr. Repiti has spoken about the economic system of capitalism, etc. But we saw, for example, when Donald Trump became president, how even in that system, things worsened for minorities, for Muslims, for Mexicans, for children who were basically put into detention centers. So things can always become worse. And therefore, we have to, at the very minimum, defend the gains that we have made. And there are gains. I mean, if you think that, for example, the various laws that governed our existence during apartheid, the pass laws, the Separate Amenities Act, the Group Areas Act, the Population Registration Act, the Immorality Act, all those various acts are no longer there. Albie said to Jordan, you can say what you are saying at the moment because of the struggle that was fought, because if you had possibly said some of those things at a particular time, you would have been silenced. Now we at least can give voice to these things that we are so concerned about, and we need to make proper use and good use of our voices, because we are no longer silenced in the sense that we would be put in jail. But it could result in a situation if certain individuals come to power who are authoritarian in nature, who don't brook dissent or alternative viewpoints, we could very well find ourselves in a situation like that again. So I think we have to defend our democracy, and we have to make our voices heard. We must make sure that that the law basically is there so that everybody can abide by that law. They go to where they need to go. And when it doesn't suit them, attacking the Constitution is not an option. We need to make that very clear to those who want to put our democracy at risk. And yes, we need many, many more years. We need commitment. We need that kind of commitment we had in the struggle, the kind of commitment that I see from people like Jordan. But we need it on a mass kind of scale. Obviously, it needs to be scaled up to look at our society and not be short-sighted and not blame the previous generations. This is not a short sort of game. This is a long game, people. And I think we need to be in it for the long haul. And as we have indicated, as Kazi indicated earlier, you know, at some point, we will run out of road as the older people. That's just the normal way of life. COVID possibly has shortened much of that for many of us as well, as has already happened. So we need the sort of generations that are coming up to look at the society that we are in currently and to see how right now our democracy is under threat and it can become worse. And we actually need to ensure that we forestall the worsening of our democracy and also get involved to attend to all the other issues that have not yet been attended to. That money, for example, I was just looking at when our democratic government, for example, inherited $13.6 billion in apartheid debt. And they took 7 years to pay off $13.6 billion. Can you imagine what could have been done with a sum like $13.6 billion if we had our debt cancelled and been able to implement it, not put it in our pockets, but implement it on behalf of and in the interests of the majority of people in this country, especially the Black majority, who have not enjoyed the privileges and who still continue to not enjoy privileges unless you have the means to do so. And the majority do not have the means to do so. So we have to defend the democracy, and it is a democracy, I would say, because we have free democratic elections. They are elected into power. I'm looking at Elizabeth's question and just answering. It is a democracy. It's an imperfect system that we are living in right now. But quite frankly, I cannot see how we don't engage with the powers that be and how we don't defend what the gains that have been made, because we don't want things to go back. We don't want things. I'm not one of those who say things were better under apartheid, because I certainly haven't been thrown off a beach, been shown the back door of a shop in the Klein Karoo, and all those kinds of major racial aggressions that happened to us during apartheid. Anybody who says that things were better then hasn't lived and been oppressed and exploited under that system. So the kind of South Africa I want to live in is not the kind of South Africa that we've seen in the last 10 years. It's the kind of South Africa where there are houses for everybody, where there is education for everybody, the kind of South Africa that we spoke about in the Freedom Charter. And that is the South Africa that at the minimum I want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Zanaria, for doing my job and summarizing the conversation, but also for adding some interesting points. Jordan?
Yes.
We are at the point now of the conversation where we said we would ask some questions, and I see Zanaria is already kind of started to answer the one question, but maybe let's can you see the chat? Maybe can you ask the question on behalf of I think Babalwa, and we put it to the panelists, and maybe we ask Dr. Apiti, who has rejoined us, to start off And then we can ask the other panelists to also answer.
So getting into the first question, Babalwa has asked, do you think South Africa has forgotten about our painful past? What is the role of remembering in critical citizenship, and how do we undo internalized oppression in a population?
Rapiti, do you want to maybe start off? Okay, is Dr. Rapiti not with us? Okay, so maybe Lorenzo, do you want to maybe take it? And then Nebakazi can then.
Yeah. So Jordan, do you want to phrase that again, just so that I am spot on as I'm reading the questions on the chat? Are we a democracy or an ideology? Is that the question we are answering?
No. So Babalwa, she was one of the first participants to ask.
I'm scrolling up. Yeah.
Yes. Did I have to read it out again?
Yeah. No, I've got it. Do you think South Africa has forgotten about our painful past, and what is the role of remembering in critical citizenship? How do we undo internalized oppression in population? So I don't think we've forgotten the painful past. I think what has happened in South Africa is that we have become anesthetized to how painful that past was. It is for many a distant memory and not a current duty to undo. And that consciousness is what we all struggle with all the time. And I mean, for want of, as Dr. Rapiti said, being philosophical about this, it is a thing. It's what Trevor Huddleston said, that, post-democracy, we got into a long, hot bath and we've stayed there forever, as if there wasn't more work to get done. The work of remembering is critical in maintaining a democracy. We have to remember. The moment we forget or we obliterate history or we undo the discourse, that's the moment democracy falters. Democracy's great contribution to its future generations is the gift of remembering why we have a democracy. And if we don't continue to bestow the gift of remembering on future generations, then we are undoing the great democratic project. Now, that's not remembering with vengeance. That's not remembering with hatred. That is not remembering with disdain. That is remembering the memories of the greatness of our resistance, the painfulness of our past, and the severity of our contributions to the struggle. Those are the stories that must be told. And in developing an active citizenship, or what Babalwa calls a critical citizenship, the NDP calls it an active citizenship, but a critical citizenship is actually a very appropriate reference to how we need to be, because the call today is for a people, for a citizenship that is engaged with the democracy, that is actively building the ferment, the brickwork, the foundations of a future that others will inherit. We live for those who will come after us. Frantz Fanon said that we must do our calling, our work with relative opacity. We must do so as if it's a natural thing to do, and get on with it, and stop wanting the limelight, and stop wanting to be heard, and stop being behind every microphone. We must do it diligently with opacity, but we must not forget to tell the stories of how we won this democracy, how we built it. And so whether it's the narrative, whether it's storytelling, whether it's a dialogue, it is of utmost importance that memories are preserved and the stories are told. The stories of heroes, the stories of victories, the stories of struggle. Those dialogues are critical. The nature of our democracy fits into the global narratives of one of the great stories of the world. And we have undermined that great story. We are not telling the world about the great story of our democracy as one of the newest democracies in the world in 1994, as the shining example of how a nation found its soul again. we have begun to undo that by not telling the stories. And so remembering is absolutely critical. You know, people say to me, oh, it's been 27 years, stop talking about apartheid. I'm saying to them, for goodness sake, you know, the Second World War is 50 years ago. The Jews still talk about the Holocaust. Slavery in the United States, black people, we still talk about slavery and its effects on current black people in the United States. Don't tell me we must move on beyond 27 years. 27 years is not even the start of the story. We have to remember the story with vigor and with passion, and not tell us to forget it and move on. It's exactly that pressure that is pushing people into this self-imposed amnesia we have in this country, and forgetting what our story is, whilst other great struggles in the world, people who have survived the Holocaust, people who have survived slavery in the United States, the struggles in the DRC and in Ghana, people remember those stories. And we are told to forget it, and that's a big mistake.
So Ryland, if I could jump in, I have somewhat of a response, but also a comment and maybe a question. And this kind of also tying in with what was said earlier about our collective amnesia. So I'm a bit confused as a young person. So maybe also just to contextualize, I spent quite a few years volunteering at the District 6 Museum and facilitating workshops with primary school, high school, and university students about history. And so I'm actually a very firm believer in everything that's been said about the importance of history, specifically with young people, and carrying over this information and how vital that is to actually understanding the issues in our communities by first seeing the problem or the roots of these issues and thereby finding a solution. But what I am confused about is how we are kind of framing it as if it is us as a nation or us as young people who are not remembering or who are not taking stock of what has happened, when we had a whole propaganda machine which was called the Rainbow Nation and this concept of born freeze. So I was born in 1997, and I have, or rather the only recollections I have of history is within the frameworks of public holidays, such as Human Rights Day, where we commemorate Sharpeville, or within kind of this Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo framework, where we look at the big names and you know what they did, how many years they spent in jail. So this propaganda happened under your generation's watch. Young people I would essentially say all young people born after 1994 and maybe even slightly before that, we were not given this information even in schools, where we learn about Jan van Riebeeck in grade 6, and then maybe if you do history in grade 10 in your senior phase, you actually engage with the TRC, you actually engage with what has happened. If you went to a maths and science school like I did, we don't even have history on offer. So where were we as young people supposed to get this information from? Museums and institutions of history, and I have said this before, are not accessible to young people. And a lot of times when we do host workshops at museums, or and I have done that with the Ezekiel Museum as well, this is the first time that these kids have actually been inside a museum. Lorenzo, you mentioned African Americans and slavery. Do you know how many young people in Cape Town do not even know that their ancestors were slaves, or that slavery existed within Cape Town? So when we talk about this collective amnesia, why are we not framing it as the propaganda that it is? And there are very specific parties that benefited from this propaganda, specifically the ANC. And then also, sorry, maybe I'm talking too much, but then I also just want to get into this idea of this defense of the democracy. Is it a democracy if the majority of people are not participating in it? When the majority of young people do not see themselves in the political parties that are meant to represent them, and therefore do not participate in elections? Is that a democracy when the majority of our people live below the poverty line, when we have a 67% youth unemployment? Who is participating in this democracy? And then I guess I just want to like close that statement off and talk about positionality. And Albie Sachs isn't here now, but this one was specifically for him. But I think it just gives a good example and kind of just frames how I see this, in the sense that I, as a young Black student, had a completely different experience of UCT than he did as a former constitutional court justice. When he walks into UCT, people know who he is. They've known for a very long time. When I walk into UCT, I am but another Black student on financial aid. And my experiences are very different. And I think that holds true for every panelist here, is that I think everyone here exists and works within the social justice sector, and all of you have been activists for a very long time. So when people engage with you, and when you engage with the world, it's through that lens. But for us, as the masses, as people who are not affiliated or defined by our activism, we experience a very different understanding of these systems and structures. But yeah, so I guess a question and a comment is kind of just about, you know, this democracy that we're defending, who's participating in it? Because the majority of people in South Africa, Black working class people, do not see themselves in this democracy. And when do we get to that point? Are we just going to keep saying democracy, democracy, when our people are saying that they do not see themselves in this democracy, when they don't see themselves being represented by the politicians in every board? So yeah, that's just what I want to say.
Thank you, Ryland. Can I take the first part of that question?
Yes, okay, please.
Sorry, my camera is not coming on. But the comment I want to make about that is that even history, even during the time of apartheid, was not in the books. It was not in the classroom. So your situation, not having history in your books, is not different, but it was in the family home. It was in what our parents told us. It was in what we experienced, whether it's underground movement people, whether it's the first time you see a protest action in the Transkei in the late 80s. History was, my teacher didn't teach me history. And definitely no one is teaching the history of this country, and it's not in the books, and our young people are not writing it down. When they do their masters, they're not writing about our history. They're not collecting the songs of our struggle. They look down on that. They really look down on that. They don't know those songs. And it's all in the songs. The text, what was happening, it is all there. So yes, we may not be evangelical and we may not be Christian and we may not pray at 8 o'clock together as a family, but we're not connecting with our own families. That is the unit of the community. This is why things like housing are so painful, is that families can't be together for just one part of the day. So the collective amnesia is great. It is great, but we didn't have it in books. I learned about Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. No one told me about Vasco da Gama, but everyone around me was wearing shweshwes with Vasco da Gama's imprint on it, because I had to not know. I had to not know. I had to not speak my language. I had to not. And we resisted under the not. So that is where, for me, if I engage a young person, I want them to know about the history of Africa. When I speak with young people from Zimbabwe, they tell me about Nyerere. That's what they tell me. They tell me as though it's their staple food. That's what liberation is about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Rapiti, do you want to respond? You are muted, sir.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a different take on this thing. I tend to agree with Jordan in many ways. I'm not old and I will not give up this fight. I'll die fighting. So I don't think that it's got anything to do with age. You see something wrong, you deal with it. I don't think anybody can forget apartheid and its atrocities. What I'm afraid of and what I do not like is the way apartheid's atrocity is being used to underscore the shortfalls in the present government. I don't like what they did, but equally, I do not like the way the present government is dealing with the situation. It's not a democracy if you get a vote once in 5 years to say, I voted somebody and you got no voice to articulate your concerns. I, for example, Ryland, you know, I'm an articulate writer. I write regularly. I'm having a problem trying to get my point across with regards to my rights as a doctor to treat patients with COVID. There is a human rights declaration on the Helsinki Agreement that allows me as a doctor to give a medication, and I'm going to state it. It's ivermectin, is the one example. If I feel as a doctor it'll benefit my patients, and I'm being denied that right. SAPRA is one of them that's in charge of it. They just point blank could put me into trouble. I can be caught against the law for that. So here are examples where we have not learned. We haven't forgotten apartheid. We have not learned from its past to do better. I mean, our education system is another one. In this country, most of our kids are really fit for semi-skilled or technical education, but why are we setting them up for high academic style of education? In Germany and in Japan, 80% of their schools, they streamline from grade 8 up into technical schools. There's nothing infra-dig about having a technical knowledge. At least you can get a job. Rather that than to get a university degree that leaves you a huge debt and no job. But who's listening? We've sung this song. We have a very pejorative type of government institutions. And you go down to the education system, you go to the health system. Yes, so I really don't think we have a true democracy because the past laws are gone. We can go freely on buses. It does not mean we've made great strides. I think in 27 years, we can do something like Botswana did. And you know what, panelists? Botswana did? A newly married couple gets 2 pieces or a piece of ground and material to build their house. What do we do in this country? We give developers the land. They charge 90% of the real rate to build a house and becomes totally unaffordable to the general population. What's this idea about squatting? People don't squat. I loathe the word squatting. People need a place to stay. So I think, and even the word informal, we shouldn't be using words like that. These are evidence of a failure of a government to deliver to its people. No matter how basic it is, they ought to do it. So I do not think in the true sense of the word, it's a democracy. Yeah, it's a democracy. If I as a doctor can go up to government and say, here is a treatment that's going to help the world, and they don't listen to me. And the reason, Ryland, and I need to say so, is that this is a very cheap drug. The vaccine is very expensive. There's plenty of evidence. None of the newspapers will publish me. So where's the democracy? Where's the freedom when it's curtailed by the big bosses, the big corporate organizations have got their pockets into some very influential people? So yes, I think what we need in this country is people like Jordan, even adults, grown-ups, people like us who feel we've been failed. We must stop being non-critical thinkers. Our universities make us monkey see, monkey do. I know lecturers will fail you because you do not say what they want you to say. That kind of archaic system of education must be done away with because these politicians, these educationists hate critical thinkers. And so what we need is more critical thinking to look at this, to safeguard this democracy. You don't go marching about, you get nothing. You burn tires for 2 days and you go back to square one. We need to be gathering, we need to be thinking, we need to be talking, we need to be having discussions like this where government has gone wrong. And we need to get this message to government. If we don't, then we're talking to a brick wall. Thank you.
Okay, so part of why we started this project of around the South Africa we want to live in was because we realized that it was important for our democracy to see it as a process that goes beyond voting every couple of years, and that we needed to find a way of involving people in discussions around the future of our country that goes beyond political parties. And so that's what we try to do with this book. And you will see, if you read the book, and please go buy the book, you will see in the book that, we talk about some of the issues that we've raised tonight and a lot more. But there's one more question that I wanted us to maybe just deal with. The question, I think it says here, Elizabeth Morton, how do we hold the structures responsible for failing civilians rather than individuals? For instance, the South African Police Services. Says here, I'm from the Pan-African Human Rights and GBV Watch Group, and we face challenges in South Africa of race versus culture versus systemic abuse and corruption. As long as government keeps a policing and justice system that is corrupt, the politicians will get away with murder. So I don't know if anybody wants to reply to that question. We've got about 5 minutes left.
I have a bit of a question, comment question in response to that, specifically about the police. And I think as people who are still kind of, organizing protests, it has become very clear to us that the police are not logical, right? They have very little crowd control, de-escalation skills, and I realized, or we realized after a while, that was intentional. That they aren't there to de-escalate, but they are only there to brutalize. But then, so like recently, I was reading this book, and it made mention of Quattro, which was an ANC exile camp. And so I found this very interesting, very, 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 very interesting. And I'm still doing my research around it, but it essentially just kind of spoke to the human rights abuses that occurred there by members of the ANC kind of elite. So the question I want to pose, and maybe you guys, would have a lot more context than I would, since I'm just kind of reading this from a historical narrative. But I feel like it makes a lot more sense to me as a young person looking at the ANC through that lens of previous human rights abuses that they've committed, because it's very confusing when we have this government that is so focused on human rights and cares for the poor, and then we have Marikana, we have Life Esidimeni, we have these abuses across the board. And after reading about Quattro and what the ANC did in exile, I don't know, it felt to me that maybe things were starting to align more in terms of what the ANC actually is, what it's always been. And I mean, there are also class analysis of the ANC that's been done, gender analysis of it. But I think this human rights aspect that the ANC has, perpetuated, I think it's a false narrative. And I'd maybe like to get an idea from the panelists, if that's your thinking, because at the end of the day, the ANC is in government, as Elizabeth has also said. So, this conversation in itself is important, yes, but the main issue, the main problem is the ANC. So can we maybe also look at that in our thinking?
Okay, the person who I referred to as Elizabeth has pointed out to me that even though her name shows Elizabeth on the screen, she is more known by her second name, which is Zona. So we have a very interesting question from Jordan. I don't know, Zanaria, do you want to perhaps try to tackle it?
I need my video to be, it says I cannot switch it on, but I'll talk anyway. So I think, yes, I can agree with some of what Jordan says in relation to where we are experiencing the breakdown, the corruption, because corruption in itself is not pro-human rights, it's anti-human rights. And I think a lot has been written about what happened at Quattro. It came to the TRC as well, where I was heading the investigative unit in the Western Cape. And essentially, those were abuses that occurred. There is no question. And I think much more needs to be written about that. But I think what also needs to be said is that those particular abuses occurred in the sort of armed military camps, and where at the time, the ANC wasn't just about armed insurrection. There were also sort of officers in various places, like Dulcie September was in Paris and others. So there were also those sort of the political work that was going on. These occurred in specific circumstances and situations within the, just hold on a second. There we go. Okay, thanks. Okay, these occurred in very specific circumstances and in situations. And essentially, I think the ANC, like many other organizations in the underground, were also quite infiltrated, and that paranoia possibly was the reason behind. But there is also, if you read about, especially what has happened, and I'm going to probably get into dangerous territory, but if one reads about the kinds of corruption that happened in the post-94 era, for example, that many of those who are implicated in corruption, etc., they are seen to be links that happened before 94, so that essentially the kind of systems that were in place, the economic systems in place, could be perpetuated in relation to the capitalist system, in relation to pulling in certain people, etc. And many of those who have been implicated in things like Quattro, etc., were involved in Konto-Sizwe, in those particular places, but by no means all, and by no means everybody, because there are a number of comrades and activists who were in the underground, who in fact essentially lost their lives, came here, got involved in operations, etc., and so were genuinely committed to liberation. So I don't think one can paint the entire sort of armed wing in that light, but certainly those abuses did occur. And I think one must accept that the seeds of our undoing were not sudden. The seeds of our undoing were planted pre-94, were planted long before the government comes into power. And I think when you think of, once again, I mentioned earlier about the kind of the negotiated settlement and the, in a way, curbing of the possibilities, the debt that we inherit, the kinds of individuals that go into parliament, the kinds of factionalism that we see now, I'm sure we will find links to pre-94 in all of these things. I don't know enough about it though, but when I was in the Truth Commission, when I saw how black operations work, black ops, where what you see is not necessarily what's going on behind the scenes. And I think there, the behind the scenes, the unknown, the subterranean, what we do not know, there is where we will find the seeds of our degeneration as a democracy. Yeah, today. I don't know if that answers your question, Jordan, but that Quattro thing is quite an explosive thing, and it has not really surfaced in the way that you have surfaced it, but I think it's a very interesting angle to look at.
Yeah, we have run out of time, and we can probably talk for hours on end. We've raised quite a few interesting issues, and I think we need to, Albie was joking earlier about us having the most book launches. these are, yes, we are using these as opportunities to promote the book because we want people to buy the book, but we also using these as opportunities for us to just talk about some of the issues that should concern all of us as South Africans. And so maybe what I'd like to do now is to give each of the panelists 1 minute to make some final comments. But I'd like the comments to be more about what is to be done. Okay. We've outlined some of the problems, we've outlined some of the issues. So maybe let's talk positively in terms of what can be done, not by government, but by us. And so maybe let's start with Dr. Rapiti.
You can give me enough time to think about it, but yeah, I think what we need to do is, like I emphasize the point that we as South Africans need to be critical thinkers. I do not think society, human beings are disunited. If you look at District 6, people live in harmony together. It's these ugly politicians, I don't care about their wonderful backgrounds back in the struggle, that divides people. People by nature are wonderful, will stand together regardless of color. And if we can become critical thinkers, and I think, Ryland, the mistake we make is we have these talk shops. We do not form ourselves something like a UDF and start saying, we will use this force and get across to government and shout so loud that they will have to listen to us. If we do it individually, we're not going to do it. But what I will emphasize again, we need to be critical thinkers, not people who just listen to anybody who tells us anything or goes back to what they did in their history and what I really don't buy that anymore. What I did in the struggle and stuff, it doesn't. It's what's on the table today for our youth, our children. They have got absolutely nothing in their future. And we have a duty to stop talking about the past and what we did, but what we can do, the things we can write and spread that wealth around. Too few people have got too much wealth. And that's the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you. Mabakazi?
Thank you, thank you. For me, it's the intergenerational storytelling and the restoration of dignity and integrity and the respect for the self and the family unit. That if we start small with what is in front of us, we may radiate that light, because we will feel overwhelmed and then we'll become cynical. So for me, it's important that the intergenerational respect is nurtured and intentionally so, because those stories are going to die with the people who have them. And we are oral cultures, we are conservative, we are indigenous, we still have, that culture is the one that helped us resist all this time. But we're running out of time to actually just document it and keep it for the next generation. And we don't take that serious enough. Thank you.
Okay, look, I'm going to ask Lorenzo, and then I'm going to ask Jordan, and then Zanaria, I'm going to ask you to make your comments when you're kind of making the closing comments also. Can we, does it work? Okay, so maybe Lorenzo.
Okay, just briefly, I think, Ryland, that the tragedy for me of the democratic narrative in this country is that we, as those who were born in the 50s and 60s, are still answering our questions today. We are not answering the questions that Jordan's generation is asking. And that's the big tragedy of our democracy. We are still in answering our own questions mode, and we have a new set of questions which a new generation is asking of our democracy. And Jordan is right. That is what is probably the most frustrating part of this conversation, because by refusing to answer the questions that Jordan's generation is asking, which is the generation of my daughter, by refusing to answer those questions, we weaken the fabric of our democracy. People don't trust us enough because we can't even answer our own questions from our own generation sufficiently enough to dignify the next generation with appropriate and not necessarily answers, but giving them the space to utter their own experiences and utter their own questions and to be the answers to their own questions. We are in the way. We failed to answer our own questions, and now we are in the way of the next generation asking and even answering their own questions. Thank you.
So I will be very, very brief. And I think this is kind of just, I'm not really going to summarize, but kind of just maybe, discuss next steps. But I think that we talk about the youth, taking the mantle and organizing themselves, etc. But in reality, we don't have the networks nor the resources. And I'm just looking at this panel in front of me, and I'm sure, ANC, UDF, there are a lot of people or a lot of parties represented here today. So I think I'd also like to ask, when will the social justice sector take the dialogue from online or even just take the dialogue to the people, to the ground? There was a social justice coalition protest yesterday. UDF showed up, and I was so surprised. It's like UDF is still, around, but it was nice. It was nice to see people that we didn't even think were going to show up. And I think when we start talking about support and when we talk about moving forward, let's look at our resources. Let's look at what we are able to offer, and let's use it. But yeah, thank you from my side.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, yeah, just from my side, as a closing comment, these discussions are very important. And I know there are lots of people who will say, yeah, but you talk and you talk and you talk. But some of the great revolutions in the world started at the dining room table, when a couple of people sat around the table and they started talking about what was wrong with the society. And then that kind of spurred them into action. And then they took it to another table and another table and another table. And soon, they had the masses kind of on their side. And so it's important for us to talk and talk and talk. And it's important for us to also look at how we go forward. Okay? And that's why I insist, whenever we close these dialogues, that we always do it with kind of a, how do we go forward? I think that's quite important. One of the problems that I have is that it's very difficult to find, for instance, corporates who are prepared to sponsor dialogues like this, because they've got their own reasons and they've got their own kind of priorities, and they don't see these kind of things as a priority. And I think we need to start convincing corporates and government that, yes, we need to feed the body. The body needs food, but the mind and the soul also needs food. And the soul gets its food from the arts, from music, from dance, from theater. And the mind gets its food from discussions like this, discussions that make us think about what is wrong with our society, and discussions that make us grapple with how we can correct things in our society. And so that's the message that I want to leave us with. And that is really what we kind of try to do with this book, was to try to answer some of the questions, but we've realized that there are too many questions that we will never really be able to answer all the questions, but we've tried, we've said we'll make a start. So thank you for attending this virtual launch, and I will now leave it over to Zanaria to make concluding comments if she wants to, but also to say a vote of thanks.
Thank you. I do want to say a few concluding comments. I want to say that whatever struggle we undertake has to be intergenerational, number one. We cannot sort of say, you know, young people one side, old people that side. We don't think in those kinds of boxes. We think in terms of there are problems in our country and we come together as we have in the past to deal with them. Right now, I do believe our democracy, whatever you want to call it, our democracy is under threat right now as we speak. And I do think we have something to attend to right now, immediately, because we could find ourselves going back 20, 30, 40 years if we do not attend to what's right in front of us right now. When we were young, we fought for not a democracy, but for a country where everybody would have a house, everybody had access to quality education, everybody would have access to healthcare, to employment, to all the good things that we want in relation to an equal society. We are the most unequal society in the world. We are a democracy, but we are the most unequal society in the world. And essentially, wherever we find ourselves, so for example, when I'm not at work, I'm in the Cape Cultural Collective, we are busy mobilizing with the arts, with young people around various projects, etc. But that is not enough to overthrow or to change a system. We have to be looking at what those problems are, and wherever we are, mobilize, organize the same kinds of tools, if not the same situation. We also have technology, which we didn't have in those days. And technology is another side of struggle in relation to how do we use technology to forward the kinds of opposition, the kinds of resistance, the kinds of societies we want to forge. I think there is going to be very little chance probably of sort of a mass movement which will overthrow our government in the current period. We have to engage that government. We have to engage the government that there is right now. And essentially, when we do that, it is with a view that we are concerned with the majority of people in this country and their needs and what it is that we thought we were fighting for at one point. Those things are still being fought for today because those demands have not been met in the current period. So I think wherever we find ourselves, we have to do the work that is necessary to take us a step forward and to defend the gains of now, but to even go further, as I've said. So on that note, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone this evening. Thank you to Ryland and Jordan for your lively facilitation of this evening's panel. And to all the panelists, Albie Sachs, Dr. Apiti, Kazi Munukwana, Lorenzo Davids, thank you very much for your considered inputs for tonight. I'd like to thank Community Chest, my own organization, for providing the platform for us to gather this evening, and especially to our marketing department for their technical and marketing support of this event. And then, of course, although we've had a small audience, we've had quite an engaged audience, and I'd like to thank you for sitting with us for the last 2 hours to have this conversation. And we hope that you join further conversations. There are many contributors to this book, The South Africa We Want to Live In. And I'm sure in future dialogues, we're going to have lots of different inputs from the various contributors to this book, and also people who are just very concerned about the South Africa we want to live in. Because we live here, we want a society that serves the needs of all its people. Thank you. Thank you, Ryland and Jordan. I think this is the end of the evening. And I don't know if there are any additional comments to make, but thank you.
Thank you.